This message was prepared by Bert Slofstra. He's a pastor at Gateway Community Christian Reformed Church in Abbotsford, BC. This week, I preached or reviewed his sermons several times in my backyard to the trees, and they all seem to enjoy it. So I hope we're all encouraged in our faith as we read the words from Pastor Slofstra. The story goes that the great detective Sherlock Holmes and his faithful sidekick, Dr. Watson, once went on a camping trip. After a good meal cooked over an open fire and a bottle of wine, they set up their tent under the stars and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, Sherlock Holmes woke up, nudged his friend, and exclaimed, "Watson, look up. Tell me what you see." Watson opened his eyes and said, "I see billions of stars." "What does that tell you?" asked Holmes. Watson thought for a few moments and says, "It tells me that there are millions of galaxies and potentially billions of planets. Furthermore, I deduce that there's probably oxygen on some of these planets, and it is possible that life has developed on a few of them." "Why? What does it tell you?" To which Holmes replied, "Watson, you fool, someone has stolen our tent." The moral of this story is that people are often blind to the obvious, which is the heart of the story we read in John's Gospel this morning. That story begins with a nameless man who has lived his whole life in the dark. Born blind, he has felt the rain on his face, but has never seen either the rain or his face. He has smelled the aroma of bread fresh out of the oven and the stink of a camel. He has touched the heat of a fire and the coldness of running water and the softness of a child's face, but he's never seen what he's tasted or smelled or touched. He's experienced all four of the five of his senses, but has never seen his own shadow. Then one day, Jesus and his disciples come along, and the disciples take notice of him, take an interest in him. A good thing, right? For this was a time when people with disabilities were as commonplace as now, except that back then, there was no option for survival for such people, but a desperate life of begging. We often complain, sometimes justifiably, about the lack of government assistance and cuts in programs that there are, but this man had no social net to fall back on. There was no National Institute for the Blind, no seeing eye dogs, no books written in Braille, no social welfare system to help him provide for his basic necessities of life. How nice, you think, for Jesus' disciples to take an interest, except that their interest turns out to be purely clinical. They see him as a theological case study, an ideal specimen for a discussion on the theology of suffering, at the end of which they'd be able to pass some judgment. "Rabbi, teacher Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" It's an awful, offensive question, isn't it? It's the sort of thing you and I have asked in the face of suffering often enough. When you've had to suffer yourself, didn't you wonder, at least privately, what you might have done to deserve it? When you've had some big problem in your life, didn't you ever think of the sins of the past and wonder, if not about yourself, then about somebody else you know? Are they still being punished for that? We do this so often with AIDS patients, or smokers who get lung cancer, or a Gen Xer who gets herpes. Sow the wind, says the Bible, and reap the whirlwind, right? The wages of sin is death. How often don't we try to make connections between our morality and our mortality? There's something comforting and gratifying about being able to lay blame, isn't there? Especially when it comes to the suffering of others, whether it's personal suffering or suffering on a global scale, famines, tsunamis, earthquakes, hurricanes. If we can discover a source of blame, we can also feel absolved of responsibility and justified in carrying on our own lives as normal. Who sinned, Jesus, that this man was born blind? The disciples of Jesus act as if they've never read all of the book of Job. Remember that Old Testament story? Here was a man who went through unimaginable personal suffering, losing everything: his possessions, his children, finally, his own health. He's tormented physically, mentally, and spiritually. And then, to make matters worse, 4 of his good friends come along and asked the who sinned question. You must have done something to deserve this. Best to confess and come clean. But then God comes along, and in 4 powerful chapters, God shuts them up. That's not to deny that according to the Bible and our own human experience, human sin and folly is a huge factor in human suffering. We all know, for example, what eating too much fat and salt can do to your heart. What can happen if you ski out of bounds and you're not found in time? What tragedies drunk or inattentive drivers can cause? What horrors the evil in a human heart can inflict in war or in acts of terrorism. Human folly, human depravity, sinful decisions have their consequences. The Bible preaches that, and we all know the reality of that. There are plenty of times there's no doubt that somebody sinned, either that person or someone close to that person. And this or that suffering is the result. But that still leaves so much of human suffering unexplained, doesn't it? I mean, why do bad things happen to good people? And a question that's just as troubling, why do good things happen to bad people? You see, the theology of Job's friends and of Jesus' disciples has its limitations. And the biggest flaw of all in that way of thinking is that if you can answer the question, who's to blame, then what? Does that heal anything? Does that make anything or anyone better? Who sinned, Jesus, that this man was born blind? And that's another interesting problem with this particular case of the blind man, isn't it? How does the disciples' theology of suffering apply to a guy who was born blind? I mean, how many opportunities to sin are there in the womb? What sorts of evils can fetuses get up to anyhow? How does their theology of bad things happening to bad people hold up in the face of congenital suffering? Well then, it must be the parents' fault, right? In an article in Sojourners magazine entitled, Who Sinned That This Child Was Born Uninsurable, a pastor and father of an autistic child wrote about his experience of being rejected and judged and blamed for his child's disability, and of being refused medical coverage because of what insurance companies called a pre-existing condition, even pre-existing to birth. And although he doesn't ask it explicitly, what parent who has a child born with some disability or disease has not privately wondered what role he or she might have had, either genetically or theologically speaking, to cause their child's suffering? It is, of course, a terrible question. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus stops them in their tracks. Who sinned? Neither this man nor his parents. And not only is that Jesus' answer to this particular case, but in so many ways it serves as an answer to every time we ask the question of who's to blame. Now, let's say that you are able to find someone to blame for one situation or another. Okay, but so what? So what? How does that make you feel now that you know? What are you going to do with that knowledge? Do you see what Jesus does? He declares the utter uselessness of the disciples' question in their manner of asking it as a way to lay blame and then go on their way in peace. And as one commentator put it, he totally refrains the problem of pain and human suffering, whether personal or global. Jesus reframes the issue. This is what Jesus says literally. Neither this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the work of God might be displayed in him. And then this crucial addition, as long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Do you hear what he says? Not that disease, disability, or suffering exists because hidden within them is a blessing in disguise, some silver lining that is a reason for it, as though God intends it as a spiritual boot camp to build Christian character and bring glory to himself. No. But quit asking about the cause of the thing and start asking about its purpose. Quit asking who's to blame and get very interested instead about how God might step in and do something in this situation. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but that the work of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. It's inevitable that we want to understand the mysteries and complications of life. Why people suffer. Why people get divorced. Why there's a problem getting pregnant. Who caused this man's blindness? Why she ended up in prison. Why he ended up homeless and a drunk, etc., etc., etc. Jesus reframes the issue and asks us to focus our sights on something deeper. He wants us to look for God in the places where we are looking for blame. That is, what do you think God is doing here, and how can we help? You can spend your life assigning blame and looking for the sin that caused this wrong or led to that condition. Don't do that, says Jesus. Don't get caught up in the useless, endless, often dead-end discussions about who's to blame. The only question worth pursuing is one about God and what God is doing and how we can enter in. See any such situation as an opportunity for you, the church, and for you, a Christian. As one writer put it, Jesus' theology of suffering, according to John 9, in a nutshell, is simply this. The world is a broken place. That's why God put you, the church, and you here. Every time you see some human suffering, you can probably figure out that someone made some mistake somewhere. But is that the work of the church? No, says Jesus. Every time you see human suffering, that's an opportunity for you to do the works of him who sent me. Every time you see someone's pain, someone's loss, someone's confusion, you're seeing an invitation from God. What can you do about it? How can you help? In this case, as we know, Jesus steps in and does a miraculous work. And sometimes the work of God is miraculous. But more often than not, it's giving a cup of cold water to somebody who's thirsty. It's visiting a person who's lonely or sick or in prison. It's providing places of healing and shelter for those who are hurting or addicted. It's feeding those who are hungry. Here, on this day and in this moment, Jesus takes one part earth, adds one part spit, rubs them together, and gently pastes the resulting gunk on the man's eyes. When it's hardened, he tells the man to go wash it off in the pool of Siloam. So, the man does as he's told, and lo and behold, he is healed. And from that day on, his life was totally transformed by Jesus. All in all, this was a story the early church loved. Not only because it changed the way the church looked at and responded to suffering, but also because it was a perfect picture of what happens when Jesus touches and enters your life. He transforms you in such a way that when the once blind man walks into town and people who saw him begging every day see him, they all ask, is that really him or isn't it? When Jesus Christ touches and enters your life, he changes you in ways that those closest to you have trouble recognizing you. The key phrase, the telling phrase of what Jesus does when he touches you is this: Is he the man who used to? He used to do that. What happened? It's like the man whose wife says, I think it's him, but his anger is gone. It's like the woman whose family says, we think it's her, but her addiction to drugs is gone. It's like the church, about whom neighbors say, we think it's the same group, but the self-centeredness and navel-gazing is gone. We now see joyful service, where there was once only a religious ghetto, and who knew what they did in there. When Jesus Christ really gets hold of you, he is all about doing a work of transformation so deep and so total that people who know you well might have trouble making a positive ID. But what this story ultimately comes down to is this: how well do you see Jesus? Did you notice? There's a movement in this story from the beginning where the key question is about the blind man, what caused his condition, to the middle part where the question is if it's really that same man who once was blind, or is it somebody else, to the end and the most important question of all: who is Jesus Christ? And do you see him for who he is? The Christ, the Messiah, the Son of Man, the one who came from God to save his people from their sins and from disease. For as John 9 goes on to tell us, there were many people who were not blind, yet could not see. People who were blind to the obvious. People who, no matter how much evidence you gave them, just got blinder and blinder. The Pharisees, John tells us, who wouldn't know a sinner from a Savior, even if they were looking right at him, investigated the sighted man's story, and that's when everything just started coming apart at the seams. They were sure Jesus was a sinner, and nothing he would do could be good. They called in the now sighted man and tried to get him to say that Jesus is a sinner. But the only thing he can do is break into a chorus of amazing grace at the top of his lungs. I once was blind, but now I see. And if the early church found in the story of the blind man a perfect model of what a life touched by Jesus looks like, that you get so transformed that people close to you have a hard time seeing that it's really you, then this part of the story about those who are spiritually blind was also a model for them and for us. Not only was it a story of their own tested faith, of the rejection and banishment they had suffered of the hands of their own families and communities when they became Christians, but also of why most people reject Jesus. You go into the street later today and ask people what they think about Jesus. And you'll get a lot of different opinions. Some of them expressed politely, and some of them not so politely. But if you push people who don't accept Jesus and ask them why not, what it will come down to in almost every case is that they don't accept Jesus because they've already made a decision not to do so. They've already made a decision ahead of time, and it doesn't matter what anybody told them. It doesn't matter how many arguments or proofs and evidence you bring to the table. They've already made a prior decision not to accept Jesus. So they don't. The Pharisees get all the evidence we wish we had as clearly and as firsthand today. Not just the healing of a blind man, but even the raising of dead man Lazarus, to which their only response was to figure out how to kill Jesus. Because God forbid that such miracles should continue, and they keep losing their status and authority. Ask anyone who once was blind, but now they see, and they will tell you that faith was born and eyes were opened when God got a hold of them. It is as the Apostle Paul once prayed for the church of Ephesus when he wrote, I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened, in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you, the riches of his glorious inheritance in the saints, that God might open the eyes of your heart to see who Jesus is, and all that he has done for you. So as the story ends, we are left to ask, in all seriousness, the question that the blind man asked the Pharisees in jest. Don't you want to become a disciple too? Do you see Jesus clearly now? Has he opened your eyes? Has he opened your eyes to the suffering in the world? Has he opened your eyes to who he is? Has he changed you so that you see now with the eyes of your heart? Has he changed you in such a way, or do you want him to, that even those closest to you might have trouble recognizing you because of the good things God is doing in your life? Of course, while blindness has a price, so does sight. To be upfront about it, it isn't easy being sighted in a world gone blind. So often the world ridicules those who see with clarity the world as it is. In the end, sometimes they run you out. It happens. It happened to the blind man who came to see. It happened to Jesus. It can happen to those who follow him. So here's a travel advisory for us who want to be Jesus' disciples and keep our eye fixed on him. You will see that the way is often narrow and the road can be hard that leads to life. If you see far enough down the road, you may even discern that at the end of the road there lies a cross. But don't let that stop you. Don't you see? In the cross of Jesus is your life. Amen. Shall we pray? Dear Lord, open our eyes so we can see more clearly the vision and purpose we have as your ambassadors here on earth. Open our hearts to the needs and hurts of others. By your strength, help us to be the hands and feet of Christ. May the work of God be displayed in us. Amen.